Who can name the country which since 1985 has had the biggest percentage increase in CO2 emissions? Anyone? China's a good guess. Any others? India? It's Thailand. Up more than 600%. Another quiz. Who can name the country which since 1985 has had the biggest percentage increase in electricity generation? Anyone? It's Vietnam. Up nearly 2,500% over the last 3 decades. Final quiz. Who can name the country which since 1985 has had the biggest percentage increase in coal consumption? It's Indonesia. Up nearly 6,000%. Why do I bring up these 3 countries? Why do I talk about these numbers? Because, in my view, they go directly to the heart of the whole discussion we've been having over the last decade over climate change, CO2 limits, CO2 caps, etc. Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia have a combined population of roughly 400 million people, and the average per capita GDP in those 3 countries is $3,700. That's about 1/3 of the world per capita GDP average, which is $13,000, and about 1/9 of the average per capita GDP here in the United States, which is over $53,000. Why are the people living in Thailand, Vietnam, and Indonesia impoverished? Why is their per capita GDP so much lower than the world average and so much dramatically lower than what we enjoy here in the United States? I think the answer is very simple. They live in energy poverty. The average per capita electricity consumption in those 3 countries is 1,400 kilowatt hours per year. In the US, it's over 12,000 kilowatt hours per year. Put another way, the average American uses more electricity in a single day than the average resident of Vietnam, Thailand, and Indonesia use in an entire week. If there's one hard and fast rule in energy economics, it's this: electricity use is a reliable proxy for wealth. So too, by the way, is our CO2 emissions. Per capita CO2 emissions are also a reliable proxy for wealth. I'm not here to argue the science of CO2 emissions or climate change one way or another. When it comes to this issue, I am a resolute agnostic. Tell me CO2 is good, tell me CO2 is bad. I'm bored with the tribalism. I'm bored with the nastiness of the argument. Because really, what we've seen so far is really a lot of argument about which side you're on. Are you a denier? Are you a catastrophist? You work for the fossil fuel industry, or do you work for Sierra Club? It's all about which side you're on instead of going to the heart of the discussion, which is the issue of scale. If you think CO2 is bad, then what? What's your solution? What's your answer if you're going to go to Bangkok or Hanoi or Jakarta? What will you tell the leaders of those countries when you suggest that maybe it isn't a good idea that they build a new coal-fired power plant? What's going to be your argument? Tell me, and do it slowly, because I'm from Oklahoma. I'm a little slow. This is where the politics of green energy, the title of my presentation today, becomes so apparent. Numerous environmental groups, numerous university professors, and I've debated some of them, continue to claim that we can run the entire world on renewables. We don't need hydrocarbons, we don't need coal, we don't need nuclear, we don't need natural gas. We can run the entire world on renewables. It's not true. It's never been true. It was true 200 years ago when those were the only options we had. Today, the world is a different place. The fundamental problem is the issue of scale. The fundamental issue is the tyranny of big numbers. Over the last decade alone, global energy consumption has increased 28%. The increase alone has been 56 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. That's an increase of about 7 Saudi Arabias of oil output in the last decade alone. I normalize my energy units around oil. Why? Because the public understands oil better than any other energy commodity. How many of you here understand what a British thermal unit is? Go ahead, raise your hands. What about a joule? What about exajoules? What about million tons of oil equivalent? What about 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas? We measure energy units in a lot of different ways. But the public understands effectively none of them but for oil. Since the 70s, the Saudis have been producing roughly 8.3 million barrels of oil per day. So I like to use Saudi Arabia units. Today, globally, we're using 256 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. That's 1.5 exajoules. I like exajoules. I like that, like how it sounds. 31 Saudi Arabias, 256 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. And of that 31 Saudi Arabias, we get 27 of them from coal, oil, and natural gas. We consume every day 10 Saudi Arabias in the form of oil, 9 in the form of coal, 7 from natural gas, 2 from hydro, 1.5 from nuclear, and 0.7 Saudi Arabias from all the political darlings of the moment: solar, wind, geothermal, and biomass. So we can talk about CO2 emissions being bad, we can say they're good. Again, I'm bored with the argument. My question is, if you think CO2 is bad, where will we find that replacement, those 26 or 27 Saudi Arabias of carbon-free energy that we can deliver every day? That's today to the people who are living in the world. I'm not even talking about population growth that is due to come in the next few decades. Where will we find those extra Saudi Arabias of carbon-free energy to bring the people in the developing world out of the dark and into the modern world? From where will it come? That's the challenge that we face. That is the scale challenge. Over the last decade alone, global energy consumption rose by 28%. Global CO2 emissions rose by 29%. In the decade in which this was the environmental issue that dominated the news, dominated all of the thinking, all of the rhetoric from the environmental groups, CO2 emissions rose by 29%. Why? Because of Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, South Korea, Malaysia, Afghanistan, Cambodia, Laos, China, India, all of these countries that are trying to improve and grow their economies, and they're doing so in the same fashion that we in America did. They're doing so with the help of hydrocarbons, and more particularly with the help of coal. CO2 emissions in the last decade in the Middle East are up 58%, in Asia up 74%, in Africa up 30%, in Europe down about 4%, in Australia down about 1%, and remarkably in the US down 6.5%. The US, again, you won't hear this from Greenpeace, Sierra Club, Natural Resources Defense Council, etc. The US is leading the world in reducing its CO2 emissions. Why? Because we have an abundance of natural gas. And over the last few years, we've seen natural gas displacing coal in huge quantities. We repeatedly hear from the leaders of the environmental movement, the climate change activists, Bill McKibben among them from 350.org, saying the U.S. should model itself on Germany. Okay, let's look at the scale numbers. Since 2005, the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions more than any other country in the world. We've reduced our CO2 emissions by about 400 million tons without a national policy aimed at doing so. Meanwhile, Germany has instituted the Energiewende, a nationwide program that has now been subsidized to the tune of about $100 billion. In the last 5 years, industrial electricity rates in Germany are up 60%. Industrial users in Germany have said that they have to see relief from high energy prices and if they do not, Germany, in the words of Germany's industry minister, says the country risks dramatic deindustrialization. Germany is held up by the environmentalists as the model we're supposed to follow, and yet in the last 5 years, in the absence of a stated national policy, the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions more than any other country in the world, and in fact has reduced its CO2 emissions 6 times more than what has occurred in Germany over that same time period. The U.S. is leading the world in reducing CO2 emissions and showing the rest of the world how to do it. The final point on scale is this: the hard reality is that hydrocarbons, for countries all over the world, rich and poor alike, provide the path to wealth and better economies. But the politics around green energy and the media that covers the energy market, and by this I mean the mainstream media, they are fixated on solar and wind and batteries and geothermal and biofuels and so on. We don't hear much about the boom in the world's biggest electricity, the fuel that provides more electricity than any other, and that is coal. Since 1973, no other form of energy has grown as fast as coal. Why? Because the world wants electricity. No other form of energy is as versatile or as powerful as electricity. The essentiality of electricity to modernity is incontrovertible. The countries that can produce cheap, abundant, reliable flows of electricity that we take for granted here in the United States, the countries that can produce abundant electricity are the ones that prosper. And the ones that can't produce cheap, abundant, reliable electricity are the ones that are poor. Full stop, period, end of story. Elvis has left the building. There is nothing else left to say. Africa is the dark continent. Why? Because it's dark. 1.1 billion Africans use about the same amount of electricity as 35 million Canadians. And so what are the countries in the developing world doing? They are turning to coal in a big way. Why is coal consumption booming? Because it's perfect for electricity generation. I mentioned that here in the U.S. we've been able to substitute natural gas for coal and in doing so reduce our CO2 emissions. That is not a possibility in Thailand, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, in China, in India. They don't have the natural gas infrastructure that exists here in the United States. We had it, we could move those, we could switch fuels here in the United States. They don't have that option. Why is coal consumption booming? Because resources of coal are geographically widespread. The fuel is cheap, and the price is not affected by any OPEC-like entity. Last December, the International Energy Agency in Paris made a remarkable prediction. They estimated that by 2018 or so, global coal consumption will exceed global oil consumption. This is an amazing projection. And this is from the International Energy Agency, which has been promoting renewables and renewable technology as much as any international entity that I know of.